The room glittered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast sparkling light across silk-draped walls, their golden glow bouncing off polished silverware, diamond brooches, and the pristine surfaces of champagne glasses held delicately by slender, manicured hands. The hum of conversation filled the space, low and cultured, a soft undercurrent of laughter rippling through the evening air. There was an aura of calm superiority that hovered over everything, the kind of confidence that comes only from generations of wealth and power, where luxury was not an indulgence but an expectation, a right. It was the kind of night where the air felt heavy with history, an exclusive gathering of the city's elite, the titans of industry, politics, and art. Everyone present knew that this was more than just an elegant party. It was a ritual, a statement of status, a subtle yet emphatic confirmation of who belonged and who did not. Sofia had known this world her entire life. Born into privilege, she had grown up surrounded by the extravagance that others only dreamed of. Her childhood was spent in vast, echoing hallways lined with expensive tapestries and gilded frames. Her youth a parade of fine schooling, horseback riding lessons, and invitations to the most exclusive soirees. She was the kind of person for whom money was never a question, merely a fact of life. Yet, even amidst all this affluence, Sofia had always sensed something missing, an emptiness hidden beneath the sparkling veneer of opulence. She had arrived at this particular gathering dressed in a gown that took a team of seamstresses months to perfect, the fabric so soft it felt like liquid against her skin, shimmering in the candlelight like moonlight on water. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, adorned with a single diamond pin that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a subtle yet unmistakable sign of her heritage. But as she entered the grand hall, nodding graciously to the familiar faces that turned her way, Sofia felt a growing sense of unease. There was a tension beneath the surface of her composure, something unsettling that she couldn't quite define. It wasn't the dress or the diamonds, nor the gilded surroundings. No, it was something deeper, something in the way the people here seemed to glide through life without any regard for what lay beyond their polished world of wealth and power. Sofia had been raised to appreciate beauty, to admire the finer things in life. She knew how to discuss art, how to critique a wine, how to carry herself with poise and grace in any situation. But as she looked around the room, seeing the familiar faces of men and women who had never known hardship, whose entire existence revolved around maintaining their wealth and influence, she felt an unfamiliar surge of resentment. This wasn't just a gathering of wealthy people. It was a display of power, an unspoken reminder that the people in this room controlled everything, from the industries that shaped the nation to the politicians who crafted its laws. They were the ones who decided what was important, who was valuable, and who deserved a seat at the table. Sofia had long ago accepted her place within this world, playing the role expected of her, smiling, graceful, obedient to the silent rules that governed her life. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, as she moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with people she had known since childhood, she couldn't help but feel that something was deeply wrong with the world she had always taken for granted. Perhaps it was the memory of a conversation she had overheard earlier in the week between two men discussing a business deal that would cost hundreds of workers their jobs. They had spoken casually, as though the lives they were disrupting were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Or maybe it was the stories she had read in the papers, stories of families struggling to make ends meet, of people losing their homes while those in this room continued to grow richer. Whatever it was, Sofia felt a shift within herself, a subtle but profound change in the way she viewed her surroundings. For the first time, she truly saw the extravagance for what it was, a shield, a barrier that kept the real world at bay, a world where people didn't wear diamonds or sip champagne but worked long hours for little pay, struggling to survive in a system designed to keep them down. She felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized the extent of her own complicity. How many times had she stood in rooms like this, smiling and nodding, while the people around her made decisions that affected the lives of countless others? How often had she turned a blind eye to the inequality that underpinned her own comfort, her own wealth? Sofia's mind whirled as she tried to make sense of her feelings. She had always prided herself on being thoughtful, on caring about others, But now she saw that her empathy had always been limited, constrained by the walls of her privileged life. She had cared, yes, but only in the abstract, never in a way that challenged the very foundations of her existence. As she stood there, her eyes scanning the room, Sofia saw not just the familiar faces of friends and family, but the faces of people who had never questioned their place in the world, people who took their power and privilege for granted, who assumed that their wealth made them somehow superior, more deserving of comfort and happiness than those who had less. She wondered what would happen if she said something, if she challenged the assumptions that everyone in this room seemed to share. Would they laugh at her, dismiss her concerns as naive or misguided, or would they simply ignore her, as they had always ignored the voices of those who dared to question the status quo? Sofia's heart raced as she considered the possibility of speaking out, of saying something that might shatter the fragile peace of the evening. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say, or even if she had the right to say it, but she knew that she couldn't continue to stand by and watch as the world around her remained unchanged. For too long, she had been content to play her part, to accept the privileges that came with her birthright without question. But now, for the first time, she felt the weight of those privileges pressing down on her, suffocating her, and she knew that something had to change. Sofia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. She wasn't sure how the evening would unfold, but one thing was certain: tonight, she would no longer be a silent participant in the charade of wealth and power. Tonight, she would challenge the very foundations of the world she had always known. As she moved toward the center of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, Sofia felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had no idea what she was going to say or how the others would react, but she knew, deep down, that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when she would finally take a stand, not just for herself, but for all the people whose voices had been silenced, whose struggles had been ignored. Sofia reached the center of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to face the crowd. The conversations around her continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind. She felt a lump rise in her throat, her mouth dry as she struggled to find the words to express the turmoil inside her. But just as she was about to speak, she caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. A woman she had known for years, someone she had always admired for her intelligence and wit. The woman smiled at her, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I understand." And in that moment, Sofia knew that she wasn't alone. There were others, perhaps not many, but enough, who felt the same way she did, who saw the world as it truly was and wanted to change it. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to give her the strength she needed to take the first step. The evening had settled into its familiar rhythm, the steady hum of conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses and bursts of restrained laughter. The grand ballroom, a marvel of architectural splendor, reflected the wealth and privilege of its attendees. It was a place where every gesture, every word, was wrapped in layers of subtle meaning, where power was displayed not in overt proclamations but in quiet, almost casual gestures. The brief touch of a hand, the way a name was spoken, the exchange of an amused glance. Sofia stood near the center of it all, though her presence seemed more like a shadow than the usual commanding force she had once been. A week ago, she might have felt differently. She would have smiled her practiced smile, exchanged clever remarks, and gracefully moved through the evening like everyone else. But not tonight. Tonight, Sofia felt a stirring deep inside her, an almost electric charge that tingled beneath her skin. She knew why she was here, and she knew exactly what she had to do. For years, she had watched these gatherings with a detached amusement, observing the social dance, the whispered deals made in corners, the alliances solidified over expensive wine and rare delicacies. It was a world built on power and wealth, but also on the understanding that nothing must ever challenge the delicate balance that kept the elite at the top. It was an intricate game, and Sofia had been a willing participant. But now, the very game that had once enthralled her felt stifling, oppressive even. She could no longer pretend to enjoy the shallow conversations, the empty flattery, the constant reaffirmation of the status quo. Her discontent had been growing for some time, simmering beneath the surface of her carefully crafted exterior. It had started with small things, The offhand remarks from powerful men about those less fortunate, the cold calculations that turned human lives into statistics. But what had once been a quiet frustration had now transformed into something much more potent, something that demanded action. As Sofia stood there, sipping her drink, her mind drifted back to the moment that had changed everything. It had been at one of these very gatherings, though smaller in scale, more intimate. A group of men had been discussing a new venture, an expansion into a struggling community. They had spoken with a cold detachment, discussing the potential profits and risks as though the people who lived there were nothing more than pawns on a chessboard. Sofia had listened in silence, the words washing over her like icy water. They were planning to displace hundreds of families, to tear down homes and businesses, all in the name of progress, of profit. And none of them seemed to care. That night, something had snapped inside her. She had always known that the world of the elite was built on exploitation, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so unapologetically, had been a wake-up call. She had left that gathering feeling shaken, disgusted by the callousness of the people she had once called friends. Now, standing in the midst of another opulent event, Sofia felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She knew what she had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. It was one thing to think about challenging the elite, quite another to actually do it. These people had power, real power, and they would not take kindly to someone like her, someone from within their own ranks, standing up against them. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she had seen, everything she had come to understand. As she scanned the room, her eyes fell on a familiar face. Alexander, one of the men involved in that business deal, and one of the most influential people in the room. He stood with a small group, laughing at something one of the others had said, his posture relaxed, confident. He had the look of a man who had never known fear, never known uncertainty. To him, the world was a place to be controlled, shaped to his will. Sofia felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. How could they be so blind, so indifferent to the suffering they caused? Did they even realize what they were doing, or had they convinced themselves that they were somehow justified, that their wealth and power made them inherently right? It was time. She couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, Sofia made her way toward the group, her heart pounding in her chest. With every step, she felt the weight of her decision grow heavier, but she kept moving forward, determined. As she approached, the conversation lulled, and the group turned to look at her. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Sofia could feel their eyes on her, curious, perhaps slightly confused. This was not her usual place, interrupting conversations, drawing attention to herself. But tonight, she was not the Sofia they had always known. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Alexander replied smoothly, flashing her a smile. "We were just talking about the latest developments in the market. Interesting times, wouldn't you say?" Sofia forced a smile in return, though inside, she felt anything but calm. "Yes, interesting indeed," she said, "but I was hoping we could talk about something a little more pressing." The tone of her voice caused a slight shift in the group's demeanor. They glanced at each other, sensing that this was not going to be a light-hearted conversation. Alexander raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but also wary. "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to continue. "What's on your mind?" Sofia hesitated for a brief moment, but then the words came, spilling out in a rush of conviction. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the way we conduct our business, the way we wield our power. And I can't help but feel that we've lost sight of something important. We talk about progress, about success, but at what cost? We're displacing people, uprooting lives, all in the name of profit. We've become so focused on our own gains that we've forgotten about the consequences of our actions." The group was silent, their expressions a mix of surprise and discomfort. This was not the conversation they had expected, not the kind of talk they were used to hearing at events like these. Alexander was the first to respond. His smile had faded, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. "Sofia," he began, his tone patronizing, "I understand your concerns, but you have to remember that this is how the world works. Progress always comes with sacrifices. It's unfortunate, but necessary. We're creating jobs, stimulating the economy. In the long run, everyone benefits." Sofia shook her head. "That's the problem," she said, her voice rising slightly. "We've convinced ourselves that it's okay to sacrifice the well-being of others as long as we come out ahead. But what about the people who lose their homes, their livelihoods? What about the communities that are destroyed? We're not creating progress, we're creating inequality, and we're doing it without any regard for the people who are affected." One of the other men in the group, a tall, imposing figure with a sharp suit and even sharper eyes, spoke up. "This is the nature of business, Sofia," he said, his voice cold. "We can't afford to get sentimental about these things. If we don't take advantage of these opportunities, someone else will. It's a competitive world, and we're just playing the game." "Playing the game?" Sofia repeated, incredulous. "Is that what this is to you? A game?" The man shrugged. "Call it what you want, but at the end of the day, it's about survival. We're at the top because we understand how to win, and winning means making tough choices." Sofia could feel the frustration building inside her, the anger bubbling up as she listened to their justifications, their excuses. She had expected resistance, but the sheer indifference in their voices was more than she had anticipated. These people weren't just blind to the harm they were causing. They had actively convinced themselves that they were doing the right thing. "I can't believe you actually think that way," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "These aren't just numbers on a balance sheet. These are real people with real lives, and we're treating them like they're disposable." Alexander sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Sofia, you're not being realistic. We can't save everyone. That's just how the world works. If we want to stay on top, we have to make decisions that benefit us, even if they're not always fair to others. It's unfortunate, but it's the truth." Sofia stared at him, her mind racing. She had known it would be difficult to get through to them, but she hadn't expected such a blatant dismissal of the very idea of fairness, of morality. It was as though they had completely divorced themselves from any sense of responsibility, any notion of what was right or just. "You're wrong," she said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even her. "It doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to choose between success and compassion. We can do both. We can create a world where progress doesn't come at the expense of others. But it starts with us, with the choices we make, the values we uphold." There was another uncomfortable silence. The group was clearly unsettled, though not in the way Sofia had hoped. They weren't questioning their beliefs or rethinking their actions. They were simply annoyed. Annoyed that someone was daring to challenge the comfortable narrative they had built around themselves. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Sofia, I understand that you mean well, but you're being naive. You've always been idealistic, and that's admirable, but it's not practical. We live in a world where power and wealth are what matter. If you want to change things, you need to be in a position to make those changes, and that means playing by the rules." Sofia looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she realized just how deeply entrenched he was in this world. He wasn't going to change. None of them were. They were too invested in their own power, too blinded by their privilege to see the damage they were doing. But that didn't mean she had to accept it. Taking a deep breath, Sofia met Alexander's gaze. "I'm not playing your game anymore," she said, her voice steady. "I won't be a part of this. Not if it means turning a blind eye to the harm we're causing. There's more at stake here than just money and power. There's dignity, and that's something I'm not willing to sacrifice." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the group in stunned silence. The room glistened with wealth, and the air shimmered with a delicate tension that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. All around Sofia, the conversation flowed as it always did, smooth, controlled, and utterly detached from the real world. The clinking of glasses, the low hum of polite laughter, the murmured compliments about the decor, the food, the attire. It was all as it had always been, a dance of appearances that everyone knew by heart. But for Sofia, something was different. She had always known the rules of this world, had played by them expertly. Her life had been one long performance, each smile, each carefully chosen word, a part of the script she had been handed from birth. But tonight, the script felt wrong, the performance hollow. For years, she had walked through these rooms, dressed in the finest silks and jewels, exchanging pleasantries with people whose power shaped the world. But now, those same rooms felt oppressive, suffocating. The gowns, the diamonds, the opulent surroundings. These were no longer symbols of success, of a life well lived. Instead, they had become something darker, a reminder of the barriers that separated the people in this room from the rest of the world. Luxury, she realized, was not just an indulgence. It was a fortress, a defense against the harsh realities that most people faced every day. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This luxury wasn't just about wealth. It was about control. All around her, she saw the evidence of that control. The people who floated through the room, laughing and chatting, weren't just enjoying themselves. They were asserting their dominance, reminding each other, and anyone who cared to look, that they were the ones who mattered. They were the ones whose opinions shaped policy, whose investments determined the fate of entire industries, whose whims could make or break the lives of countless people who would never set foot in a place like this. As Sofia stood there, a glass of champagne in her hand that she had no intention of drinking, she felt a deep sense of unease settle over her. It wasn't just about the inequality, though that was part of it. It was about what this world of luxury and wealth had come to represent. It was about the way it separated people, the way it created an us and a them. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she could no longer pretend that she didn't see it. The room was full of people she had known for most of her life. Some of them were family, others were friends, business partners, acquaintances. But as she looked around, they all seemed like strangers to her now. How could they continue to live like this, she wondered, knowing what they must know? Did they truly believe that they were entitled to this kind of luxury, this kind of power, simply because of the circumstances of their birth? Or had they convinced themselves that they had earned it, that their success was a sign of their inherent superiority? Sofia had never considered herself to be naive. She had known for a long time that the world wasn't fair, that wealth and power were distributed unevenly, that there were those who struggled just to survive while others lived in unimaginable comfort. But she had always believed, somewhere deep down, that there was still a balance to be found, that it was possible to live a life of luxury without losing sight of the values that truly mattered: kindness, compassion, dignity. But tonight, standing amidst the glittering opulence of this gathering, Sofia was no longer sure that balance was possible. The luxury that surrounded her wasn't just a symptom of inequality, it was a cause. It created a distance, a separation between those who had and those who had not. It allowed the people in this room to live their lives without ever having to confront the realities of the world outside their bubble. And that, she realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. The people in this room weren't bad people, not in the traditional sense. They weren't cruel or malicious. Many of them were generous, donating large sums of money to charity, funding scholarships, supporting the arts. But their generosity was always controlled, always conditional. It was always about maintaining their position, about ensuring that the world remained as it was. A world where they could continue to live in luxury, untouched by the struggles that define the lives of so many others. Sofia's mind wandered back to the conversations she had overheard earlier in the evening. The casual way people discussed the stock market, the latest mergers, the acquisitions that would make them even richer. It was all so disconnected from reality, so detached from the impact those decisions would have on real people. To them, it was all just a game, a way to keep score. But to the people whose jobs were on the line, whose livelihoods depended on the whims of these powerful few, it was life and death. She thought about the families who would be displaced by the latest development project, the workers whose jobs would be outsourced to increase profits, the small businesses that would be crushed under the weight of corporate giants. And she thought about how easily those in this room dismissed those concerns, how they justified their actions with talk of progress and efficiency. Sofia had always believed in progress. She had been raised to believe that the world could be made better, that innovation and development were the keys to improving the lives of everyone. But now, she wasn't so sure. What kind of progress was this, if it left so many people behind? What kind of progress was it, if the price of success was the dignity of others? The word dignity echoed in her mind, a quiet but insistent reminder of what was at stake. That was the real issue, she realized. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about dignity. The dignity of the people who were being trampled underfoot in the name of progress. The dignity of the communities that were being torn apart by forces beyond their control. For too long, the people in this room had equated dignity with wealth, had believed that luxury was a sign of worth, that those who lived in comfort and opulence were somehow more deserving of respect than those who struggled to get by. But Sofia knew now that this was a lie. True dignity didn't come from wealth or power. It came from how you treated others, from how you lived your life in relation to the people around you. And in this room, amidst all the luxury and extravagance, there was very little dignity to be found. Sofia's eyes wandered across the room, lingering on the faces of people she had once admired, people whose success had seemed like something to aspire to. But now, she saw them differently. She saw the way they clung to their wealth, the way they justified their privilege, the way they insulated themselves from the consequences of their actions. They had built their lives on a foundation of luxury, but that foundation was crumbling. And deep down, Sofia knew that they must feel it too. The quiet, creeping awareness that their world was not as secure as they liked to pretend. But even if they felt it, even if they knew that the world outside their bubble was changing, they would never admit it. They would never acknowledge that the system they had built, the system that had allowed them to live in such unimaginable luxury, was deeply flawed. To do so would be to question everything they had worked for, everything they believed in, and that was something they simply couldn't afford to do. Sofia felt a wave of sadness wash over her as she realized just how trapped they all were. These people, with all their wealth and power, were prisoners of their own privilege. They had built walls around themselves, walls made of gold and crystal, walls that kept them safe from the harsh realities of the world. But those walls also kept them isolated, disconnected from the very things that made life worth living: empathy, compassion, understanding. She thought about the people outside this room, the people who lived without luxury, without power, people who worked long hours for little pay, who struggled to provide for their families, who faced uncertainty and hardship every day. And she thought about the dignity those people possessed, a dignity that came not from wealth or status, but from the way they faced their challenges with grace and resilience. There was a quiet strength in that kind of dignity, a strength that couldn't be bought or sold, a strength that the people in this room would never understand. Sofia's mind raced as she tried to reconcile the two worlds she now saw so clearly: the world of luxury and privilege that she had been born into, and the world of struggle and hardship that lay just beyond its gilded walls. For so long, she had believed that it was possible to bridge the gap between these two worlds, that it was possible to live a life of wealth and luxury while still being a good person, a compassionate person. But now, she wasn't so sure. The luxury that surrounded her, that had once seemed so desirable, now felt like a trap, a prison that kept her from truly understanding the world. It was a barrier that separated her from the people who lived without it, a barrier that made it impossible to see them as equals, as people whose lives and experiences were just as valid, just as important as her own. And as she stood there, surrounded by wealth and power, Sofia realized that she couldn't go on like this. She couldn't continue to live in a world that placed so much value on luxury, that equated wealth with worth, that allowed people to justify their privilege while ignoring the suffering of others. She thought about the conversations she had overheard earlier, the way people spoke about their business ventures, their investments, their plans for the future. It was all so calculated, so cold. There was no room for compassion, no space for empathy. It was all about winning, about maintaining control, about ensuring that they stayed at the top. But what kind of life was that? Sofia wondered. What kind of life could you live if everything was about control, if every decision was made with the sole purpose of preserving your own power? Sofia realized with a start that she no longer wanted that kind of life. She no longer wanted to be a part of a world that valued luxury over dignity, that placed wealth and power above compassion and understanding. For the first time in her life, she saw the world as it truly was, and she knew that she could never go back to the way things had been. The luxury that had once seemed so appealing, so seductive, now felt empty, hollow. Sophia turned away from the glittering chandeliers, the shimmering gowns, the polished smiles of the people around her. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't stay here, that she couldn't continue to live in a world that was so disconnected from reality, so devoid of true dignity. But where could she go? What could she do? The question swirled in her mind, but for the first time in a long time, Sophia felt a sense of clarity. The answers weren't going to be easy, and the path ahead was uncertain. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay here, not like this. Not anymore. The morning light streamed through the grand windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the estate. Sophia stood at the edge of the room, gazing out at the expansive gardens that stretched out before her, their manicured perfection a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her mind. The party from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, the laughter, the opulence, the clinking of glasses, all a performance of wealth and privilege that now felt so distant from the reality she had come to understand. She had spent most of her life moving within these walls, surrounded by the trappings of success, immersed in the power games of the elite. Yet now, more than ever, she was struck by how fragile that world was. The events of the past few weeks had shifted something deep inside her, and she could no longer ignore the feeling that had been growing. This life, this world of luxury, was a veneer, and beneath it lay a void, an emptiness that wealth and privilege could never fill. Sophia knew that her decision to speak out against the very system that had raised her, that had granted her every advantage, was not just about challenging the status quo. It was about reclaiming her own sense of dignity, her own voice, in a world that tried to silence those who questioned it. And now, as she stood in the quiet aftermath of her decision, she understood that there was no going back. The path forward would be difficult, filled with uncertainty, but it was a path she had to walk. As her thoughts drifted back to the conversation with Alexander, she felt a pang of sadness. He had been her confidant, her partner in so many ways, and yet he had failed to see the truth that now seemed so clear to her. His words echoed in her mind, as sharp and cutting as they had been in the moment. "You're being naive, Sophia," he had said, his tone laced with the same condescension she had heard from so many others in this world. "You don't understand how things work. If you want to make a difference, you need to be practical. You can't change the system from the outside." Practical. The word rang hollow now. For years, she had believed in the necessity of playing the game, of navigating the intricate web of power that governed the world of the elite. She had thought that by remaining inside the system, she could influence it, change it for the better. But she had come to realize that the system was designed to resist change, to protect those who benefited from it at the expense of everyone else. And in trying to work within it, she had become complicit in its perpetuation. In no more. Sophia turned away from the window and crossed the room, her steps purposeful and deliberate. The house felt empty, though she knew it wasn't. The staff moved quietly through the halls, performing their duties with the kind of invisible efficiency that allowed the wealthy to live in their world without ever confronting the labor that made it possible. She had always taken it for granted. The way the house seemed to run itself, the way the meals appeared perfectly timed, the way the rooms were cleaned and prepared without her ever having to ask. But now, she couldn't help but think of the people behind those invisible actions, the cooks, the maids, the gardeners. She had always been polite to them, of course, kind, even, but her kindness had been distant, detached, rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the power dynamics at play. It was easy to be kind when you were in control, when you held all the cards, but true compassion, true dignity, required more than politeness. It required an acknowledgement of the inherent inequalities in the relationship and a willingness to challenge those inequalities. Sophia had spent her life living in a world that ignored those challenges, that glossed over the uncomfortable truths in favor of maintaining appearances. The charity events, the gala fundraisers, the philanthropic initiatives, they were all part of the same performance, a way for the wealthy to assuage their guilt without ever addressing the root causes of the problems they claimed to care about. She had participated in that performance, had played her part with grace and poise, believing that she was doing her part to help. But now, she saw it for what it was, a distraction, a way to keep the system intact while giving the illusion of change. The real work, The hard work wasn't done in ballrooms or boardrooms. It was done in the streets, in communities, in places where power and privilege had little reach. And that was where she needed to be. Sofia's decision to step away from the life she had always known hadn't come easily. It had taken months of soul-searching, of questioning everything she had been taught, of confronting the discomfort that came with acknowledging her own privilege. But it had been necessary. The night of the party had been a turning point, a moment when she had finally spoken the truth she had been avoiding for so long. "I'm not playing your game anymore," she had told Alexander, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I won't be a part of this. Not if it means turning a blind eye to the harm we're causing." The memory of that moment filled her with a sense of both pride and fear. She had stood up for herself, for her beliefs, in a way that she hadn't before. But the consequences of that decision were still unfolding. She knew that many in her circle would see her actions as a betrayal, that she would be ostracized, perhaps even ridiculed, for her choice. Alexander's words had made that clear. "You're throwing everything away," he had said, his voice cold and distant. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." But Sofia did know. She knew that by stepping away from the world of luxury and privilege, she was stepping into a world of uncertainty, a world where she would no longer have the safety net of her wealth to protect her. She knew that she would face challenges, that her new path would be difficult. But she also knew that it was the only path that made sense to her now. The world was changing, and she had to change with it. In the weeks following the party, Sofia had begun to take steps toward her new life. She had started selling off the property she owned, divesting from the companies that had once been the source of her wealth. It wasn't just about distancing herself from the symbols of her old life. It was about breaking free from the structures of power that had kept her bound. She had also begun reaching out to organizations working on the front lines of social justice, seeking to understand how she could best contribute to the causes she cared about. But the process was slow and, at times, overwhelming. For so long, she had been insulated from the realities of the world outside her bubble. Now, as she confronted those realities head-on, she was struck by just how vast the challenges were. Poverty, inequality, systemic racism, environmental degradation. The problems seemed insurmountable, the solutions elusive. And yet, for the first time in a long time, Sofia felt a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew that she would make mistakes along the way. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back. The life she had left behind, the life of luxury and privilege, had been a life lived in denial, a life that denied the suffering of others, that denied the interconnectedness of all people, that denied the possibility of a better, more just world. As Sofia began to build her new life, she found herself drawn to the stories of others who had made similar choices, people who had walked away from wealth and privilege to dedicate themselves to causes greater than themselves. Their stories were filled with struggle, with sacrifice, but also with hope. They had found fulfillment not in the accumulation of wealth, but in the pursuit of justice, in the fight for dignity for all people. It was that fight that now defined Sofia's path. She had come to understand that true dignity wasn't something that could be bought or sold, wasn't something that came from wealth or status. It was something much deeper, something rooted in the way we treat one another, in the way we stand up for those who are marginalized, in the way we challenge systems of oppression and inequality. Dignity, Sofia realized, was about more than just individual success. It was about collective liberation, and that was what she was fighting for now. Not just her own freedom from the confines of privilege, but the freedom of all people to live with dignity and respect, to have their voices heard, to have their humanity recognized. The transition wasn't easy. There were days when Sofia questioned her decision, when she wondered if she had made a mistake in walking away from the life she had known. The comforts of her old world were hard to leave behind. The security, the familiarity, the ease with which everything had once come to her. But those moments of doubt were fleeting. For every challenge she faced, there was a reminder of why she had made this choice. The conversations she had with activists, the stories she heard from people who had been directly impacted by the injustices she was now fighting against, the sense of community she found in places she had never expected to find it. All of these things reinforced her conviction that she was on the right path. Sophia had once believed that dignity could coexist with luxury, that it was possible to live a life of privilege while still holding on to a sense of morality, of compassion. But she had come to see that true dignity required more than just good intentions. It required action. It required a willingness to let go of the comforts and conveniences of privilege in order to stand in solidarity with those who had been denied those comforts. The world of the elite, the world Sophia had once inhabited, was built on a foundation of exclusion, on the idea that some people were more deserving than others, that wealth and power were the ultimate measures of success. But Sophia had come to understand that real success wasn't about amassing wealth or climbing the social ladder. It was about contributing to the creation of a more just, more equitable world. And that was where she found her dignity. The morning sun continued to rise, casting a warm glow over the estate as Sophia made her way through the house for the last time. The walls that had once felt like a fortress now seemed confining, small in comparison to the world she was stepping into. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where this new path would lead her, but she knew, with a certainty she had never felt before, that it was the right path. Sophia took one last look at the house, at the life she was leaving behind, and then, with a deep breath, she stepped through the door and into the world beyond. A world that was waiting for her. A world that needed her. A world where dignity, not luxury, was the ultimate goal.